and president, will tell you a little bit about our organization.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the third of our 4 exciting speakers we have in store for you guys. Our events team hopes you're just as excited as we are to hear them speak. Before we begin, let's talk a bit about what the Youth Economics Initiative is. YEI is the world's largest coalition of high school economics clubs. We're a student-run 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering youth entrepreneurs and economists with pathways towards careers in finance, economics, and business. Outside of our public events and webinars like this one, we offer a wide-ranging set of resources and opportunities exclusively available to our chapters and members, including our 2 flagship competitions, over 40 weeks of engaging economics and financial literacy curriculum, and our multiple initiatives that provide service and research opportunities for our students. Over the past year, we've impacted the lives of over 1,200 students, distributed $1,500 in prizes, and established chapters all across the nation. As we continue to expand, our team is committed to opening new doors for our members and empowering students to find and explore their passion for economics and finance. If you want to know more about the YEI, please check out our website at theyei.org and follow us on our socials. Now, Alyssa will introduce our speaker, Rakesh Vohra.
Rakesh Vohra is the professor at the University of Pennsylvania and has done research on how a partially effective vaccine would affect the economy. He is also part of the Penn Integrates Knowledge Program, an initiative whose research contributed greatly to the integration of knowledge across disciplines. Today, Professor Vohra will answer a few overarching questions about the economics of pandemics. We will have time for a Q&A at the end, so please save your questions until then. Now, everyone, please welcome Professor Rakesh Vohra.
Oh, thank you very much. Do I have control of the screen? Yes, I do. Just give me a second to get set up. And sorry, it's taking so long. Okay. Feel free to interrupt me with questions at any time. And I think Ian will be monitoring the chat. So if you prefer to ask your questions using that medium, you're welcome to do so. I thought what I'd do is I would pick 3 questions about pandemics to illustrate how basic economic principles provide some insight into what the answers might be. And the very first question that you might think about is the following: are lockdowns a good idea? The question is not rhetorical. I'm happy to entertain answers. Does silence mean you all think they are a good idea?
Professor, is your screen supposed to be black?
No, it isn't. Let's see what's going on. See, can you see my screen now? No.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can, right? But if I do full screen mode, you can't. Okay. So I don't know why that's happening. Are the slides legible?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Let me just try one more thing. This might work. Can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So, first question, are lockdowns a good idea?
Nikhil Nair said in the chat, to a degree they are good, but over time they have an increasingly harmful effect on the economy. And then Ishan Gupta said, yes, they're a good idea.
Okay. Anyone want to argue that they're a bad idea? You don't have to believe the argument. You can at least say what the argument is.
Also, if you want to talk, you can just raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Someone could say it's destroying our livelihood.
Okay, so one argument is that it destroys our livelihoods.
And
Other
then
arguments?
in the chat, Nicole said they're bad because they decrease the flow of money, like cash flows.
Well, yes, because business activity clearly declines, and so therefore some people are left poorer. And so you've probably been reading the debate, at least in the newspapers, between the pro-lockdown and the anti-lockdown camps. And the thing I want to emphasize here is the question itself is not a very good one. Let me turn it around. When somebody says we won't have a lockdown, what exactly do they mean?
Like business as usual, right?
But what does business as usual mean?
So it's like you can like walk around without wearing a mask. You can go into like T4 and order things without having to like put on a mask or socially distance.
Okay, very good. But now, when you're doing that, you recognize there's a risk of infection, agreed?
Yeah.
Okay, so what will you start to do?
So like,
Oh, okay.
oh, now go.
Oh, I was just gonna say that even if there isn't a lockdown, I think that people can try to required to wear masks, but still a lot of people would wear masks and they would try to stay away from other people or use Amazon and things like that. So I think even if there isn't a mandatory lockdown, some people will still try to stay cautious.
Yes, so the point is the presence of the infection raises the costs for us for engaging in certain kinds of transactions. Given that there's an increase in cost, we are going to respond to it. How? Some of us will wear masks, and as you pointed out, some of us will substitute away from going to the store and ordering through Amazon. Some of us will choose not to go to restaurants and order takeout with greater frequency than we did before. Does that make sense? Okay, now that's on the consumer side. On the producer side, what would we expect to happen? Well, if you recognize that people aren't coming to you because they think that the risk is too great, you're going to make costly investments to try to reduce the risk for them, which means you're going to invest perhaps in greater sanitation. You may choose to forego revenue to ensure physical distancing in your hotel or on your aeroplanes. So the point is, if we don't do a lockdown, it doesn't mean the alternative is life goes on as usual. The alternative, if you think about it, looks a lot like a lockdown. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so really the question here that you have to ask is not whether a lockdown is a good idea or not, but whether a coordinated lockdown is better than an uncoordinated lockdown. What do I mean by an uncoordinated lockdown? I mean, each of us individually make decisions to reduce the volume of our economic activity to avoid risks. Each of us make investments either in sanitation or in reducing volume so as to reduce the costs associated with purchasing goods and services from us, right? That would be an uncoordinated lockdown. We each individually are making these decisions. The alternative is a coordinated lockdown where there is an entity, typically the government, which coordinates all of these decisions for us. In other words, you all wear a mask now. You all shut down now. So that's really the question. Which of these is better, coordinated or uncoordinated?
I think like a coordinated lockdown would be better, right? Because if you like look at like other Asian countries, like they have like a coordinated lockdown. That's pretty good. They like made everyone like chill at home. I think like South Korea, like everyone just like stayed at home. The government like gave them testing and food, so I feel like that's better.
Okay, so the argument for the coordinated lockdown is that there might be some efficiencies if we all make these decisions together. Now, the second reason you might care about an uncoordinated lockdown is because an infection imposes a cost on the economy for everyone. Does that make sense? And an infection is what would be would be a classic example of an externality. So what's an externality? If I engage in an action or consume something or produce something that imposes a cost on you, that's called a negative externality. So let me start with an externality that you're all familiar with. If I buy a particular Van Gogh painting, that imposes a negative externality on you in that you cannot own that Van Gogh painting. Okay? Let's try a more exotic negative externality. If I am infected with a communicable disease and I go out and about and you are then infected because I am out and about, I have just imposed a negative externality on you. Everyone with me so far? Okay. Now, there can also be positive externalities. I can be polite to you. That generates a positive externality. Okay. Now, externalities are not a problem if the market prices them in. So in other words, if you have to pay for the externality that the negative externality that you impose, or I get paid for the positive externalities I provide because I'm good-mannered, kind, and so on and so forth, then there's no problem here. Everyone is paying for the costs that they're imposing on society, and everyone is receiving a reward for the benefits that they generate. Okay? The interesting case is externalities in which that's very hard to do. And the classic example of such an externality is what's called a public bad, if it's a bad thing, and a public good, if it's a good thing. There's something I want to emphasize here. Something is a public good not because it's good for you, because broccoli would be a public good then. Something is a public bad not because it's bad for you. Right? You need two extra conditions. The public bad or good has to be non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So the essence of non-excludability means the following. I cannot prevent anyone from enjoying the benefits if it's a public good. No one can avoid the cost if it's a public bad. Okay. The second condition that's important is what's known as non-rivalrous, which is me enjoying the benefit doesn't prevent you from enjoying the benefit. Me becoming infected does not reduce the chances of you becoming infected. Okay. Everyone with me so far? Okay. Now, before we go any further, it's worthwhile asking, are there any examples of public bads or public goods other than infection?
Would climate change be a public bad?
Okay, so it would be a public bad in the sense that it would impose what kind of costs on me that are unavoidable? Right, the whole point of the public bad is that nobody can avoid the harm. And if it's a public good, you cannot exclude anyone from enjoying it.
Yeah. Wait, you're looking for examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like stuff like lighthouses, I think or like streetlights. That's a public good.
Well,
I guess like
okay. Let's look at the streetlight example. you could argue that when somebody puts up a street light, you cannot prevent anyone from enjoying the benefits of the light at night. And so you could argue that makes it non-excludable.
Oh, it's rival though.
Well, you could argue that it's non-rivalrous in the sense that if I get the light, it's not that the light is any dimmer for you, right?
Yeah, but only
Now,
so many people can use the light because like it only has like it's only so big.
very good. So it is non-rivalrous if we think about the fact that it has only a, the light source will have only a limited range. So it's going to violate the non-rivalrous assumption, unless you find a way to shrink humans and pack them into a smaller space. Okay? Now, I'd like you to think about the non-excludability, which you agreed upon. That is a function of technology. You could imagine a world where the residents of a city are given sensors. If you don't live in the city, you don't get a sensor. Okay? Now, what does the sensor allow me to do? Well, when I'm walking along the street at night, because I'm a resident and I've paid my taxes, the street light turns on for me. You, however, do not have a sensor. You do not pay taxes. The street light does not turn on for you. Right? So another thing to keep in mind is whether something is a public bad or a public good is to some extent dependent upon the technology that we currently have.
Yeah.
Right? So I would agree with you that maybe 10 years ago, street lights would be public goods that satisfy non-excludability. Do I believe that they're non-excludable today? No, because we have the technology to make them excludable.
But is it worth it to buy that technology? Like giving every person a sensor?
No, very good. That's a separate question. So when we think about whether something is a public good or a public bad, it's not that we require them to satisfy the textbook definition that you see on the slide in front of you. The question we're really asking is, well, practically speaking, is it non-excludable? Practically speaking, is it non-rivalrous? Okay, and that's what you should always keep in mind. Okay, infections would be a classic example of a public bad. Now, are they non-excludable? Well, to some extent they are, because you could choose to avoid the infected person if you were able to tell they were infected. Are infections non-rivalrous? Well, you know, there's a physical limit to how many people can be infected in any one instance. So there's a certain degree of rivalness. So once again, but the argument is, practically speaking, it looks like a public bad. Okay? Now, what's the issue with a public bad? The issue with a public bad is that it is impossible to price them in. And when I say impossible, I mean that there is a formal statement of that, which I'm not going to go into. But it boils down to the following problem. Suppose I'm infected. I understand that if I go out and about, I'm going to infect you. But I don't care. You're not me. I only care about myself. And if I get a benefit from going out and about, I do not take into account the cost that I'm imposing on you. Does that make sense? Okay, now, if my benefit is sufficiently large, then I'm going to go out and about, even though the cost, the collective cost I'm imposing on the rest of society can be huge. Does that make sense? Okay. So infections, as I said, fit this, because when I make a decision to go out to work, I'm focused on my money, my earnings, my well-being. I am not taking into account the cost I impose on others. Okay. Now, if I could price the externality in, meaning if you're infected, supposing I charge you for leaving the home, right? Then I would be pricing it in. But here is the challenge. You can either charge me for leaving the house, or you can subsidize me for staying at home. Which should you do?
Subsidize, right?
Subsidize, because if you charge me, I'm going to look at you and say, Charging me doesn't feed the children. I'm off to work. Okay? So you're going to subsidize me to stay home. Who pays for the subsidy?
The government. Wouldn't a subsidy not be practical though on like for something like an infection, because then you would have to pay everyone in the country, and that would quickly get really expensive.
Well, hold on one second. We'll get to that in a moment, but I want you to think carefully about the subsidy. You immediately said government, but let's not bring the government into this just yet, which is presumably if I'm worried about you being infected and I don't want to be infected, here's a solution. I pay you to stay home. Does that make sense?
Wait, so if a person's infected, everyone just pays them to stay home?
Here's the crucial point, everyone. This is the nature of the public bad. If I'm infected, I infect all of you, okay? And now, so now let's think about the proposal. All of you should pay me. Well, then one of you says, wait a second, if the rest of them manage to collect together enough money to keep me home, then you don't have to pay anything, agreed?
Yeah.
Because you get the benefit, right? That's the free rider problem. Okay. So when we have public bads and public goods, we have a free rider problem, and that means we cannot price them in. So externalities have generally, the interesting externalities have this feature, and infection is a good example of that, right? So this is a long-winded way of arguing why a coordinated lockdown is better than an uncoordinated lockdown, because in an uncoordinated lockdown, the cost of the infection is distributed in a way that is not necessarily efficient. If we could coordinate, we could achieve better economic outcomes at a lower cost. Does that make sense? Now, there's a debate about what a coordinated lockdown would look like, precisely what policies would you have, and one of those things that you might debate is whether we should be subsidizing infected individuals to stay home. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. Okay? But let me close this question by pointing out that we actually do have an example of a country that chose, in some sense, an uncoordinated lockdown, Sweden. Okay? Now, the interesting thought experiment is if you look at Sweden's GDP, their growth rate during this period was not that much different from the neighboring countries that implemented a coordinated lockdown. Okay? So really the thing I want to leave you with is this debate about whether lockdowns are good or bad, that's the wrong debate. The right debate is about whether you want a coordinated lockdown or an uncoordinated one. You're going to get it anyway, a lockdown. The question is, do you want to shape it or do you just want to let it happen depending on the individual, depending on the decisions of uncoordinated decisions of many individuals? Any questions before I move on?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, in order to have an uncoordinated lockdown with something like an infection, wouldn't it also require to have a reliable system of testing? Because right now, a lot of people have the coronavirus, but since they don't have symptoms, they don't even know that they have it. So wouldn't that make it a lot harder to identify the people who are infected?
Very good. Okay. So if you are thinking about a coordinated lockdown, you're quite right to point out that a major bottleneck would be testing. Right? Because presumably what we would want to do is test people to decide who should stay home and who should go out to work. And so believe it or not, that is my next question. So if you've been following the news, you know that there are various individuals who argued, and they've argued since the beginning of the pandemic, at least in the United States, that we need a massive program for testing. So the question I'm asking here is, how useful is testing in assisting an economy to recover from a pandemic? I'm going to argue that actually testing alone is not very useful. So even if you had access to unlimited testing, which we don't have currently, but even if you had access to unlimited testing, I'm going to argue that testing by itself is not particularly useful. Now, why am I prepared to make such a statement? Testing only gives us information. Doesn't tell you what you do with the information. And importantly, will someone who has tested positive for the virus choose to stay home? So will they?
I feel
No.
that since, oh, sorry,
No,
you can
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah, I feel that since the United States, the people in the United States, they value individualism over a lot of things. And I feel that even if they are infected, they don't have like an honor system in South Korea. Like in South Korea, it worked relatively well because people knew that they had to stay home for the public good, and they had this sort of ingrained in their culture. And even after testing, they implemented an app, the government implemented an app so that everyone knew where people with the coronavirus went. So they had a follow-up to the testing that allowed the general public to know where to go, where to not go. And that prevented further spreading of the virus. And that was why it was effective.
Okay, so I'm going to dispute a couple of things that you said there. And in particular, the idea that somehow there's a cultural difference. The question I'm going to ask you is this: were South Korean citizens subsidized during the period of the lockdown? The subsidy could be direct. It could be in the form of furloughs, in which the government pays the firm not to fire people.
Yeah, they gave them like subsidized housing and subsidized food, right? So I would say like most people, like if you are asymptomatic, but you've already been infected, there's no subsidy keeping you at home. There's no, like, from a infected person's perspective, right? Like, what do you have to lose? Because like you're already infected, so like it doesn't really, and if you don't really have symptoms and you're able to go outside, like what's stopping you? Like the benefits are better if you go outside.
Yeah, the benefits exceed your costs, right? And so my own view is that this is a trade-off that people make all over the world. I am very skeptical of arguments that rely on culture. A basic assumption of economics is that people respond to incentives. So both in Western Europe, as well as in other parts of the world, the government stepped in and essentially subsidized people to stay home. And in fact, so did the US, right? Now, one important thing to note is that the subsidies were blanket subsidies. Everyone got them up to some income level. Right? Now, you could imagine something more targeted, which is we test you before we give you the subsidy, right? And you could imagine that you test people at work, you test people at home. You could imagine a system where you do the following, which is if you turn up for work and you turn out to be infected, then we punish you. If you decide to stay home and we test you and you're negative, we punish you. Okay. Under what conditions would this make sense? It would make sense in a world where infection than anyone else. Is that a reasonable assumption to make?
Professor, I believe you cut out there. Do you mind repeating the
Oh, I'm
question?
sorry. So I don't know where I cut out, but let me go back at least a couple of sentences.
Could you say the assumption again?
Okay, so the United States also offered subsidies, but they offered blanket subsidies to everyone up to a certain income level. You could imagine a more targeted way of handing out subsidies. For example, if you turn up for work, we test you, and if you turn out to be negative, we punish you. And if you stay home and we test you and you turn out, sorry, I got that wrong, let me start again. You turn up for work and you test positive, we punish you. If you choose to stay home and we test you and you tested negative, we punish you. I phrased it in a negative way. I could phrase it in a positive way, which is, if you're uninfected, I will subsidize you to go to work. If you're infected, I will subsidize you to stay home.
What happens to people that like already don't have jobs? Do we just subsidize them?
Well, so this is an interesting question. So the thing you have to worry about is, why do people go outside? Do they go outside just to work? Do they go outside to entertain themselves? Right? So notice you have to test both at work and at home, because what you're worried about is that you decide to go out to a restaurant, have a good time, and then you become infected. That doesn't help, right? So that means any regimen that's based on testing and incentives has to also control your behavior between work and home. Okay? And one of the ways we can do that is we can do that with severe punishments for getting infected.
Wait, what do you mean by punishment? Like a subsidy or like an actual punishment?
Well, okay, so I can reward you for staying home, in other words, for not taking risks. So in other words, order takeout rather than go to the restaurant. Okay? Or I can punish you for taking on risks. It's not immediately obvious whether the carrot or the stick would work. Okay? But let me give you an example of a punishment. What if the government were to say that we will not pay for any medical care that was caused by COVID?
Oh, darn. But like, people will still get it, right? And people that get infected, even if they, like in the initial stages, right? If they don't know
Well,
they've been like exposed.
If you're
right?
worried about that, the government could say 3 weeks from now.
Yeah.
I think that on the surface, that definitely seems really harmful, because if the purpose of containing the virus is to limit the number of deaths, then not offering medical care would increase the number of deaths. But I think that if you had such a severe punishment like that, then that would probably definitely motivate people to stay at home more. And it would also motivate people to start using more online platforms, which I think a lot of people aren't doing. Like me personally, I still go to the grocery store and things like that. But if there was such an enforcement like that, I think I would start using Amazon Fresh more. So
Yeah.
I feel like that could also have some benefits.
Yeah. So my point is, I'm not advocating one policy or another. I'm simply pointing out that if we think about how to deal with the virus, testing alone is not enough. We have to couple testing with rewards and punishments to influence behavior.
Professor,
But if you, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
I had a question. So you were talking about subsidies, but the issue with subsidies, isn't it that for every single person, it's different how it will affect them? Like if you were to subsidize me with $10 for not going outside, that's not going to be enough for me. So how do you actually quantify how much it should be?
Okay, so this is an excellent point. If I'm subsidizing you to stay home, in principle, that's relatively straightforward, which is I should compensate you for your foregone income. Agreed? And if you happen to be working, then as the government, I actually know something about your income.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? On the other hand, if you choose to go to work, I actually should be paying you a premium above what you're making because of the added risk that you're taking on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now that's problematic. It's not clear what that premium should be. So, so I'm not claiming this is easy.
Yeah.
But you know, we make judgments about this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so at someone somewhere will have to make a best guess, and then that will determine the premium. Now, I can tell you that grocery stores during the early part of the pandemic did that. They were offering their employees, I think, a premium above the regular hourly wage to come to work.
And so that means that there wouldn't be a blanket subsidy, right? It would be personalized based on each person's
I mean,
income.
right. I mean, there's no reason to do a flat subsidy. You would want to tailor it to as much as you can to the individual circumstances.
Professor, I had a question. So you were talking about a system in which you couple the testing with a system of rewards and punishments. But
Yep.
what would happen if, for example, there's been a lot of instances of people testing for false positives. So then if someone falsely tested positive and then they received a punishment, but then it was later discovered that they weren't actually testing positive, how would you with that?
Very good. So the tests that we have for detecting the infection are by no means perfect, as you point out. And there is the risk of false positives and false negatives. But to some extent, testing will actually help you with that. And so let me say something. If you don't understand it, it doesn't matter. The accuracy of a test depends not just on the technology of the test itself, but also depends on what's known as the underlying base rate. In other words, the proportion of individuals in the population who are infected. Okay. The advantage of a scheme involving subsidies for staying home and, let's say, premiums for going to work is that you can get people to sort themselves into high and low risk groups. This goes to the question I asked earlier. You probably have a better idea of your chance of being infected than I do, because you know what you've been doing in the last week. Right? Now imagine I could sort people into two groups. Those who diligently stayed home, that group I would know would have a very small proportion of people who are infected. And therefore, when I see a false positive from that group, I know I should ignore it. Okay? Now, if you tell me that you've actually been out and about to the beach, to the bar, so on and so forth, then I know that you're from a group which will probably have a very high proportion who are infected. So when the test comes back negative, I know to discount that particular test result. So in fact, this scheme of subsidizing and rewarding people for either going to work or staying home can actually improve the accuracy of these tests. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. It doesn't get it all the way to 100% accuracy. And so the subsidies and the rewards that you build in will have to account for false positives and false negatives. Okay. Let me go to the third and last question. Would a partially effective vaccine be better than no vaccine at all? Okay. Most vaccines are not 100% effective. They are only partially effective. And the reason that their overall effectiveness is so high is because lots of people are vaccinated. Okay, there are two questions with vaccines. One is, will enough people get vaccinated? Happy to talk about that. I wasn't intending to. But the second is, even if lots of people got vaccinated, would it still be a good idea to give them a vaccine that is only partially effective? Does the question make sense?
By partially, what would the effectiveness rate be?
So the answer is less than 100%. Existing vaccines, I think the effectiveness is something like between 30 and 60%. So meaning if you're vaccinated, the chance, well, sorry, I got that wrong. So it's around 30%. The chance that you will be infected goes to about a third from, something like 90. So I'm not describing this very well. So if you're vaccinated and I put you in front of somebody who is infected, your chance of getting the disease could be as high as 30% with a partially effective vaccine. So it doesn't go, so your chance of contracting the disease doesn't go down to zero. Okay. Okay, the reason why I think this question is interesting is because around the world, we are trying out something like 17 different vaccines. None of them is guaranteed to be 100% effective. A number of people believe that vaccines will save us, provided we solve the problem of getting enough people to be vaccinated. Right? Here, I simply want to point out that actually it could be that with a partially effective vaccine, we could be worse off. Now, I want to emphasize, I'm simply pointing out this could happen. I'm not saying it will happen. Right? And I'm putting this in to illustrate how economic reasoning sometimes produces results that many people would think are counterintuitive. Right? But once again, the important idea here is that people respond to incentives. Okay. So let me tell you about something called risk compensation. Okay. When the risk of becoming infected from contact declines, then you will become less careful about who you come into contact with. Do you agree with that statement? From the faces I see nodding yes, I'll assume that's general agreement. Okay. Now, a vaccine reduces your probability that you will become infected upon contact. Therefore, if the vaccine is around, that reduces your incentives to take on costly measures to avoid being infected. Okay. If the second effect outweighs the first, then what will happen? We will see an increase in infections. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, an increase in infections is not a bad thing. Okay. Let me say that again because it sounds awful. An increase in infections is not a bad thing. Okay. It depends on what we were doing that resulted in the increase in infections. Okay. Why is that? You make trade-offs. You're trading off the risk of infection against the cost of avoiding it. If the cost of avoiding it is high enough, you're better off taking on the risk. Okay. My point is simply because infections went up doesn't mean we're worse off. There was a benefit. The reason the infections went up was because we avoided taking costly actions to prevent the infection. And those costs might have been high. Everyone with me so far? Okay. So just because infections go up is not a sign that something bad has happened. What we care about are the net benefits. In other words, the benefits that we collectively enjoyed from avoiding the costs of being infected minus the cost of being infected. We care about both those things at the same time. Okay.
Sorry
Now,
to interrupt,
sorry, go ahead.
Professor. I have a question regarding that. So would the individual be doing that cost-benefit analysis, or would this be like a decision on the whole, like as a
So
society?
each individual by themselves is making that trade-off.
Okay.
So the point is, if you choose to go out and about, then you have made the decision that the benefits of doing so exceed the costs or the risks of infection.
Okay.
So the point is that's not a bad thing, right? In other words, it's only a bad thing if your decision to go out and about raises the costs for someone else. That's the externality part. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Now, the important idea here is that risky interactions are complements. Complement is a fancy word for saying that two things are complements. If you have more of one, you want more of the other. Okay? Classic example are shoes. If you have a left shoe, you probably want a right shoe. Okay? Now, with infections, risky interactions are complements. And why are they complements? Here's the story to keep in mind. Let's suppose I'm already engaged in an interaction with Mr. A, And that interaction runs a risk of being infected, of me being infected. Why? Because Mr. Ray could have the virus. Okay? Now, the reason I'm engaged in that interaction is because I see a benefit from interacting with Mr. Ray. Okay? Now, suppose Mr. Ray is engaged in a risky interaction with Mr. B for the same reasons that I'm engaged in an interaction with Mr. Ray. Okay? Now you ask me, do I want to have an interaction directly with Mr. B? Well, what's my trade-off? I have to think about the benefit of the interaction with Mr. B, and I have to weigh that against my chance that I will become infected. But here's the catch. I'm already trading with A. A is already in contact with B. So if B was infected, there's already a channel by which I'm going to get infected. So therefore, the increase in risk from me interacting with B is relatively small. Why? Because I'm already interacting with A. And therefore, what do? I decide it's a good idea to interact with B. Notice that pushes up the overall risk in the economy and collectively makes us worse off. Okay? Now, this is a threshold phenomenon, which is if the infection were sufficiently effective, this doesn't happen. Now, the precise range of effectiveness of the vaccine, we don't know. Okay? But it's something to keep in mind. If the vaccine is not effective enough, introducing it into the population isn't going to help. And I think I've exhausted my time, so let me stop here unless there are questions.
So you said that an increase in cases is not necessarily a bad thing if it's preferable to the alternative.
Yes.
So in your opinion, what would be an alternative to which an increase in cases would be preferable?
Well, if you told me that there was no negative externality, then an increase in cases would occur simply because each one of us thought that the benefit of the interaction exceeded the cost. Agree?
Yeah.
Right? So the tricky part is when there's this externality. Because then each of us individually are not taking into account the additional costs that we're imposing on the rest of the economy.
So we had a speaker yesterday, his name is Anton Kornick, and he talked about kind of the social cost of COVID externalities, and he quantified that social cost to be around $50,000 to $80,000. So, and that would be including the cost that you would impose on others because you would infect approximately 2.5 people if you did get the virus. And so does that mean, so does that,
and then what? And then he's estimating the lost income?
yes, so that goes into it. So and that's per week.
No, so I would argue, so from what you've told me, I would argue that that's an overestimate because if you know there are infected people in the population, you will take precautionary actions. And so what we have to pay attention to is what are the costs of those precautionary actions. Okay? So let me give you an extreme version of this. For a professor like myself, the cost of precautionary action is essentially zero. But for somebody waiting tables, the cost of precautionary action is the lost income. So the calculation, I think, would have to depend on sort of, it would have to depend job by job.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right. So then, well, so my question was, how would you actually determine what the benefit is, like the social benefit of meeting people? Because a lot of people are meeting people thinking that that benefit is more than the cost. So,
well, the point of a world with negative externalities, it is that benefit exceeds your individual cost.
right.
Right? You're not taking into account the social costs you impose on everyone else.
Ah, okay.
Right? Now, the economist response to this is the only way to get the incentives right is I've got to make you take account of the social costs that you're imposing from your actions.
Mm-hmm.
And how do I do that? Well, I have to have a way of charging you for that. And then that leads you to think about, well, supposing I withhold medical treatment for COVID.
Mm-hmm.
It's an extreme form,
Yeah.
but it illustrates what you should be thinking about, which is what are the costs or what are the rewards that we should be offering for taking precautionary actions.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
What country, in your opinion, has been the most effective at like controlling the coronavirus?
I'd be hesitant to say because I don't think we really have the data just yet. I mean, certainly what could point, one could, okay, you could say, you know, isn't New Zealand a success story? Well, the answer is it's not a success story until we know the costs of avoiding. So you need to have an estimate of the counterfactual, right? Which is how many deaths would they have had they not intervened the way that they did? And then how much has the intervention cost them, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing I don't know, but it seems to me this goes to the issue of why one might want to think about coordinated lockdowns, is I would be willing to bet that tourism has taken the biggest hit in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But notice, everyone in New Zealand has benefited from the fact that tourism has taken a hit. Agree?
Yeah.
Okay, now the question is the following. Was the cost borne by the tourism industry shared by everyone in New Zealand?
No.
If you tell me the answer is no, then I'm not going to say that New Zealand succeeded for the simple reason that New Zealand succeeded simply by screwing one segment.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right? In other words, the government has to do two things. It has to control the pandemic and equitably distribute the costs associated with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I think
I
that.
have,
Oh, go
I have
ahead.
a question on something you were talking about before. So when you were talking about the false positives and false negatives, you said that like you would be grouping people into different categories. So like the people who diligently stay home versus the people who are continuing to go out.
Yes.
And you mentioned that if you had a false positive in a category where people were staying home, then you would discount it. But how would you know that it was a false positive? Because it would look the same as any other test, right?
Okay, you're right. I shouldn't have phrased it that way. So if you came from a low risk group
Mm-hmm.
and you tested positive, I would discount that.
Okay.
Okay, that's what I should have said. And how do I know that's the right thing to do? The answer to that is Bayes' theorem. And if you look at yesterday's science section of the New York Times, on the last page of that section, there's an article about Bayes' theorem and a discussion of just this issue. And this issue comes up in the newspapers every 5 years regularly. So if you go back in time, you'll find articles about Bayes' theorem fairly frequently because it's relevant in a variety of places.
Well, thank you so much. That wraps up our Q&A session for today.
Well, thank you all very much for your attention.